And that is that we are co-creating the conditions that manifest, and that it isn't about only one group of people, but really about all of us. And so that this discussion doesn't take the slant, and I don't think it would have been appropriate if it had, of looking at white privilege, for example, and what does that mean? How has that been co-created along with the new Jim Crow? But the Dharma would. And then just to backtrack and say, historically, the Buddha was extraordinarily radical in inviting and being open to anyone in India. And I want to preface this by saying that when I was in India in a monastery, the sewage system was like an open hole, and there was a channel that took the sewage took the sewage openly into a tank that had a little cover on. And so it was always smelled very intense. But it was only the untouchables who could empty out the sewage. They would come to the tank every 3 or 4 days, and they would empty out the sewage. And the reason they were called untouchables is because they were doing that work, and, quote, who would want to touch them? And then because they were untouchables, it was their work to do that kind of work. And it was very intense to see that happen every 3 or 4 days. And it touched me, the power of the caste system, and the way when you were born into India, you were relegated without any mobility at all into a particular type of caste where only certain work could be done. And it was, you could tell, it was absolutely impermeable. No other Indian, even in the monastery, would touch the untouchables. And in fact, if you were an untouchable, you had to walk in such a way that your shadow didn't cross the path of any Brahmin. Otherwise, you could be prosecuted in the Brahminical religion. So you were that untouchable that your shadow was considered impure. So when the Buddha opened the Sangha, he included everyone. And he even made a statement about it, because when Ananda and his coven Devadatta and several other cousins of Ananda wanted to join the Sangha, they brought their barber with them. And then they wanted to give all their jewels to the barber to go back to their home once they had ordained. And the barber, once he had this whole lot of jewels, said, "You must be crazy. I'm not going back with all these jewels. The robbers will come and they'll kill me. I'm going to ordain with you." And the Buddha ordained him first. And that meant that he was senior to all those very wealthy other young men, and that he was first in line all the time for begging, for rituals, for everything else. So there were ways in which the Buddha over and over again supported the inclusion of people, no matter what their caste was, which is hugely big. I could go into a number of different suttas where the Buddha talks about why caste has nothing to do with what's important. But just because we're a little more short of time, to say that he was unswerving in his understanding that what made a human being a dignified human being was their virtue and their wisdom. And he said that over and over again, and he would say that to Brahmins Like there was this young Brahmin who came in who was like super like, I'm a hotshot. And I've heard about you. And he was actually rude to the Buddha and said, you're worse than flesh-eating insects. He actually said that to the Buddha because he assumed as a Brahmin he was superior to the Buddha, and once you associate with untouchables, then you are regarded as an untouchable. And the Buddha was absolutely unwavering in saying, human dignity has nothing to do with your birth, your caste, your class. It has to do with whether you have wisdom and virtue, whether you're ethical or not. So I think that often the radical teachings of the Buddha isn't always emphasized in how the Dharma is transmitted, but he was very radical. And then just to say one other thing, recently scholars have found that the special rules and difficulties supposedly he gave to women are actually written in a different language. And it's said that it came later, that the patriarchal structures that the Dharma was being practiced in began to influence what people thought the Buddha said, and it became more and more sexist. But that initially, how the Buddha invited women, which was just as radical as untouchable castes, is up for grabs now, is questionable in terms of any inequity around that. So just to say that. And then to look at, in that context, the Buddha was saying, and we talked about this on Wednesday too, that this is not just an individual practice but a community practice. And that he was saying that liberation has to happen in community as well as personally and individually. And that he created a Sangha without inequity, because it's clear he understood the importance of having a community and a communal structure that was totally honoring of everyone in the community in order that they might come to awakening. So just to say that. And then to also look at the ways that he framed awakening in terms of self and non-self. Because he was so clear that the construction of the ego, the complex of feelings and ideas and the way we actually inhabit our body and live in our body, that the way that we do that when it's unconscious will always bring suffering. And that when we bring awareness to that process, when we bring love to it, we begin to deconstruct that. And that the construction of the self or ego, that sense of identity as white people, for example, that is something that it's sort of like a bird. When a bird makes a nest, it goes and it grabs whatever in its environment. That ignorance will take the messages and the values and norms of a culture and build an identity around what's given. And it is that sense of identity then that is defended in the misunderstanding that happiness and freedom comes from defending that identity. So when we think about, well, why was it that poor white working class people got seduced into aligning with landowning classes and then later monopoly capital, it's because of that process of identity creation. And that it is based on defense and separation, that the construction of all of us, the construction of the place where we're identified and how could we not be as white, depends on separation and disconnection. And because the process is separate making, then we have to defend it. So in the Dharmic perspective, of course, we could say around Michelle Alexander and around class and around gender and sexism and every creation of identity through the social matrix of inequity, that it is going to continue over and over again. And that's what she's saying. She's saying that even though slavery ended and Jim Crow ended, that the dynamic didn't end. And partly it didn't end because of the ways that identity is constructed on the individual level. And then how that construction manifests socially and culturally and structurally. So when we look at the social consequences of our construction, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And it's not because we're bad, or it's not because we are like particularly immune to suffering in our hearts, or what can I say, less compassionate. It's that ignorance is heartbreaking, and that ignorance keeps manifesting and expressing itself over and over again according to the conditions, and that is exactly the theme of her book, that slavery hasn't ended, and that because conditions are different, it's taken a different expression. So when we acknowledge that, then also we're acknowledging the ways that we, not intentionally at all, but just the nature of how we contribute to that co-creation. And that's what's beautiful about this particular exploration, is that because she goes into all the details, she's challenging us to look at the ways that we have created assumptions about ourselves and other people that have remained unconscious. And that's what she's saying. She's saying she herself, as an African-American liberal, was unaware of what was happening because she also had taken messages and built a sense of identity around herself that didn't include the reality of what was going on. And we are all doing the same thing. And she said, there was something in her book that she said that was so striking about, no, it wasn't that. That was yeah. Should we open the door more? Seems like some people are nodding off. Where is it that she said? What did she say in that? It was that she used one particular expression that I love, that the new Jim Crow is based on indifference by white people. And I love that because the result of the ways that that ignorance has worked is that it means that when we are in the non-target location, when we have been conditioned into the kind of privilege that we have, the result automatically is indifference. And it is not intentional at all, but that it's that not being able to see clearly the dynamics in order to act. And that's why, does that make sense? Let me just stop there. And that's why the word insight meditation is so radical, because it is about that transformation of indifference into clear seeing. And when there's clear seeing, then there's compassion and action. And so when we're talking about dismantling that, we're not just talking only about doing structural work of ending prisons. We have to include that dismantling of our own ego and identity that keeps perpetuating that system. And that's one of the beauties of coming together as a Dharma group to look at this particular system, because there is no way, for those of us who are white, there is no way that we can contribute to the transformation that she's asking of us unless we look at the dynamics of how we, in each of us in particular, defend ourselves and live unconsciously in that indifference and privilege. So I think maybe I'll stop there, because that seems like a lot.
Could you speak up a little?
Oh yeah, I think that maybe, sorry. No, maybe it's not on. Yeah, but I'm finished.